Well, good morning. This is Mima. I've entitled today's video, Resting by a Reflection Pool. And last week I shared with you some of the events that had happened from the time that I was born up until 1980. And so today I was led to go back and reflect some a little bit more. And in 1 Corinthians 11:2 it says, "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the traditions which I have delivered unto you." So we have strayed a long way from the traditions that I held dear whenever I was a child. And looking back and seeing the change that's brought about, it reminds me of that story about the frog in the water. They said that if you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, he'll jump out. But if you put a frog in a cold pot of water and slowly heat it up, that he will just stay right in there. He won't ever realize that it's getting hot until he dies. And I think that is what has happened to America. So I think it's really good that the Lord has caused for me to look back on what has happened and let you see what all has happened up until 1980, and just the time that I was only like about 35 years old at that time. So anyway, I want you to take a listen to what I felt like the Lord would have me to share. And I may have to read some of this. I can't remember everything I want to tell you, so forgive me if I have to read. The South was devastated because of the war between the states. And the farms and plantations that had been so thriving and prosperous, when the guys came back from the Civil War, their plantations were ruined. Some of them had to even give up the farm completely, and because a lot of the cities had even been burned. So during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, sharecropping and tenant farming took the place of the plantation owners. And when the stock market crashed in 1929, this brought about the Great Depression, and the banks closed, so nobody had any money. And because of that, there was worldwide, or at least widespread, hardship, homelessness, and a lot of people were hungry. Millions were hungry. And I was born right in the middle of this depression in 1934. And I was the last of 8 children. Mom and Dad had 8, and they, for the most part, had raised them during this depression. And my dad was a sharecropper. So he didn't own his own farm until I was 2 years old. And this was in 1936, was when my daddy finally got enough money, to buy our own farm. And I knew that, looking back today, I know now that we were poor, but so was everybody else in the community. So we didn't think anything about it. I mean, so I had to wear chicken feet sack dresses. They were pretty. I liked them. It didn't bother me at all. And Mom and Dad were never bitter, and they never talked about how things were tough for them. And I know they had to be, but I never knew it. And children, parents back in those days, they didn't want to burden their children with adult problems, and so that was a good thing for me. So I grew up in a very simple and naive atmosphere when I grew up, and I wish more people could experience that today. But everything was centered around family and the church and your neighbors, and our neighbors helped each other out. And doors were never locked, and I personally never even heard of a murder until I was like 10 or 12 years old. And Bullock County, the county I grew up in Georgia, South Georgia, they operated under the blue law. And the blue law was that you did not we didn't even have legal alcoholic beverages sold in the county, and church. All businesses were closed on Sunday. Nobody worked on Sunday. And the people that did out in the country, they were frowned upon. Even hunting and fishing. Nobody didn't go hunting and fishing because that was just disrespectful of the Sabbath. So Most people in my community were hardworking people. They attended church and they lived above reproach. Of course, we had a few that were not. I mean, you know, they were kind of outcast in the community. But children were taught manners, upstanding morals, and they had respect for parents and for authority in the school. And parents believed in the biblical principle that if you, the way to spoil a child was to spare the rod, and so there was corporal punishment. But we never heard of child abuse like we hear about it today, because if you spank a child a couple of times, they quit doing what they've been doing wrong. So, but by the 80s, home life had changed because there were so many job opportunities now whenever the New Deal that Franklin Delano Roosevelt put into effect, and soldiers returning back from World War II, it was a prosperous time, but a lot of the jobs where you can make a lot of money within town, so people left the farms in great numbers and they moved to the city. And they left behind families and church and neighbors, and they wanted to provide their children with the things that they had never had. And they had so many more conveniences. We all wanted the conveniences of refrigerators and electric stoves, my goodness, and heating and air conditioning. I mean, these were luxuries for those of us that never had it. And so this caused a lot of women that they went to work instead of staying at home. And I was one of those that worked, but I felt like that I had to provide the family with the things that we needed, so I worked. But I don't think it was until 1973, no, it was 1979, when that year was proclaimed the year of the child. Well, they wanted the child to be taken care of, and they didn't want it to have to go through all of the atrocities. So it sounded like a good thing on the surface, but what it was really a push for the government to start sending the children to kindergarten, because, and I believe this was true because I'd heard this given as a reference, and it said that if I can have your child and teach them for the first 6 years of their life, they will be what I have taught them to be. And so I thought, oh my goodness, this is scary, because who's going to be teaching the children? But by that time, I already had a teenager when I heard it, or she was grown really. So anyway, but it was, I remember when I was in the Homemakers Club, which I mentioned to you, and we had a display at the county fair, and I was in charge of it, and I made up this booth that said, the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. And I had a cradle there with a baby in it with a sign that says, who's rocking the cradle? And so I think that right then, God showed me that it's very important for moms to be at home. But, hey, we haven't changed a whole lot. Public schools were desegregated. I mean, were segregated. Public schools were. And, but they were supposed to be separate but equal, and I'm not sure if that was true, but that was what it was supposed to be. But we were taught the basics. We had a daily devotion, and we recited the Lord's Prayer, and on Fridays we had chapel. But in 1954, the Supreme Court declared that segregated schools were unconstitutional. And then it was in 1963 that same Supreme Court declared Bible reading and reciting the Lord's Prayer to be unconstitutional. And to show you how things were, in my graduating class, we only had one boy that went to college, and there were only maybe two of us that went to a business school. So all of these things, the events that had happened, changed the culture and the customs in which we lived. In my day, girls were taught to be ladies, to have manners. We were taught how to dress decently and how to behave modestly. Shorts were frowned upon in the 30s and the early 40s, but after World War II, shorts and two-piece bathing suits gained a lot of popularity. The divorce rate back in the 30s was 2.3% out of 1,000 people, but by the 80s it had jumped to 22.6%. And there were probably illegal abortions, but I never heard of them. I didn't even know what an abortion was until after I got married. People looked on people that carried on with extramarital affairs or had children out of wedlock they were frowned upon, and it was a no-no. And I'm not saying that that should have happened, but it was just a fact. But movies and TV entertainment has always appealed to me. I like movies, and I like really good movies on TV. And some great classic films were produced during the 1930s. But I think the moral decline really started when Rhett Butler said to Scarlett in Gone with the Wind, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." And that was horrifying that he would say that on television, because we never even saw men and women in the same bed together. I mean, they would go to bed and the lights would turn out and we'd know what happened. We had sense enough back then to figure it out. But for all these people today, they have to be shown explicitly what goes on when the lights turn out. So, just stating a fact. And then it was in the 50s, after television came into being, that they had the sitcoms. And they were laugh shows. And there is a saying that says that if you can get somebody to laugh about something that's prohibited, you can get them to accept it. So a lot of the sitcoms brought about things that, we would have never said that, but since they said it, it was funny, and so we laughed, and now we accept it. I think that television and movies were some of the greatest contributors to the decline of our morals and customs, along with taking God out of the schools and teaching children what they needed to know about the Lord. And I think another thing, as a Christian, I believe that Israel is God's time clock for world events. And the Bibles tell us that in the end times that the Jews would return back to Israel, the promised land that God had given them 4,000 years ago. And so in 1917, the Jews gained support for establishing a homeland in Palestine after wandering, like God had told them they were going to wander. They came it was in 1917 that they got an agreement that they could establish a homeland in Israel, at Palestine, and that was in 1917. And then in 1948, Israel became a nation. And so that was whenever it was established. And I remember my daddy, he believed that was one of the signs that was going to produce the end time events. And he said the generation that saw that happen wouldn't pass away before the return of the Lord. And of course, my daddy was my hero. I believed everything he said. So it has been ingrained in me that I might see the return of the Lord. So I want to be ready when he comes. And since 1960, I have seen the God of the Bible removed from our public schools. In the summer of 1973, that rock and roll festival that I told you about in Woodstock, it became a symbol of the hippie movement, and it produced a counterculture which advocated free love and mind-altering drugs. So one atheist had the Bible reading barred from the schools, followed by eliminating public prayers. Creation was replaced by evolution. So I began, by 1980s, the moral code that I had lived by was slowly vanishing for the most part. But I was kind of like the frog in the water. I was vaguely aware of the change. So like I said, I grew up to be naive with a mother and father that loved me, who loved the God of the Bible. I was taught obedience at home. I was not exposed to the evils of the world. I felt safe and secure. At home, I was taught to be a lady, and my guide was, don't be doing anything you wouldn't want Jesus to see you do, because he's watching everything that you do. So it really kept me straight during that period. And so I hope you have enjoyed looking back to see what has happened that's shaped your life, whether you know it or not. Join me next week. So listen, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks.